Hello, and oh, that's a bit loud, isn't it? We turn it down a bit. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this event today on climate accounting and how to spot false claims. My name is Theo Mitchell. I'm head of UK, Europe, and International Climate at the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. We're the world's largest funder, which focuses on improving the lives and rights of children around the world. And I am here because we strongly believe that there is no justice for children without climate justice. And underpinning climate justice, we must have a robust set of rules and processes which can inform multilateral and national policies and regulation. We're here today to talk about the science of carbon accounting and why that matters and how better data and analytics can help underpin a more robust approach to policy and regulation. I'm not going to speak for long. We've got a stellar lineup of speakers, some of the finest minds working on this today. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Professor Jean-Pascal Van Ypersel, who's going to talk to us about, I was going to frame the discussion.
Yes, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here again at the Bellona Foundation, when I've been invited a few times. So I'll give you a very general introduction to the issue of carbon accounting, starting from some key elements of climate science. Just a reminder, I think you all know that we are using the atmosphere as a free dustbin. Well, it's essentially free. It's part of the problem for greenhouse gases. We are putting in it about 2 times more than what ecosystems and the ocean can remove every year. And therefore, we are actually thickening the insulation, the thermal insulation layer that those greenhouse gases constitute around the planet. And this comparison with the thermal insulation layer actually helps to understand, without any complicated climate model, why we need to go to net zero emissions as quickly as possible. Because as soon as we don't do that, and as soon as long as we don't cut those emissions to net zero, we will have that continued increase in that concentration, and the result of that increase in concentration. And I like this visual presentation because it suggests the thickening of that insulation layer. We have the increase in temperature, and you see how close we are from this red line here, the 1.5 degree limit, which I like very much, because I think the children you are caring for would be in much safer situation in a 1.5 world than in any temperature above. So why is this happening? Well, as I said a second ago, because we are putting more CO2 in this kind of bathtub, the atmosphere, than the amount that is removed by natural systems, ecosystems, and the ocean. And as long as the situation is that way, the concentration of CO2, which is the quantity that matters, will continue to increase. So let's look a little bit at the details. These are numbers, particularly for the next slide, which are relevant for the last decade of the 20th century. It doesn't matter. Of course, they're slightly different today, but the process and the principle are the same. So this is the carbon cycle before human perturbation, the big loops between ecosystems and the atmosphere, and the other big loop between the ocean and the atmosphere, exchanging. These are gigatons of carbon per year. So overall emitting 190 gigaton of carbon per year, but absorbing 190 gigaton per year as well. So this was the situation before the Industrial Revolution. The amount of carbon in the atmosphere was 280 parts per million, or 600 gigaton of carbon. What we have done, and these are the numbers again for the last decade of the 20th century, is to emit much more actually than what those natural systems can absorb. You see, they do what they can to absorb about a quarter of what we emit in the soils and the vegetation and trees and forests, and another quarter in the ocean, contributing, by the way, to the acidification of the ocean. But the other half, broadly, is what accumulates in the atmosphere. So that's a problem that we have. And we know that the fraction that will remain in the atmosphere will increase with time. This is a diagram coming from the latest IPCC report published last August. And these percentages show the total percentage of CO2 emissions over the entire period 1850 to 2100 that would be taken up by land and ocean for a very low scenario up to the very high scenario. And you see those percentages are decreasing when the scenarios become higher. There's a kind of saturation effect. The ocean becomes warmer. It cannot absorb as much because water absorbs more CO2 when it's cold. Also because we deforest, so less forests are available to absorb carbon. Soils cannot absorb as much CO2 when they are warm either, etc. So the percentage that is taken up by land and ocean is decreasing. So you certainly heard a month ago what Greta Thunberg said about what we're doing here. I wanted to give an example of an issue related to this carbon accounting problem. We need to be very careful about. It is not related to carbon accounting related to products, which we are going to discuss in details. It's more related to the overall issue. And I want to relate this discussion, these few points I'd like to make to this article published 2 days ago in the Washington Post, which I hope you have seen, and you have not. I'll discuss the key points from that article here. All those slides, by the way, are since 10 minutes from now on my webpage, and you'll be able to download them afterwards. And if you click on those links, you'll be able to find the Twitter thread that, but also the article itself. So what does it say? It says that there's a GN gap between what nations report in their report to the UNFCCC Secretariat and the real amount of greenhouse gases they emit in the atmosphere. And it's a gap that it's as large as about 10 billion ton of CO2 equivalent per year, which is a lot. It's about a quarter of total emissions for the year 2019, for which they made the exercise with a broad team of scientists, including the Global Carbon Project, etc. And at least almost 60% of the gap stems from how countries account for emissions from land. Many countries attempt to, and one of the big problems, and these are quotations from the article, okay? Many countries attempt to offset the emissions from burning fossil fuels by claiming that carbon is absorbed by land within their borders. And they don't make the distinction between the effect of explicit human action and simple natural forestry. And of course, if you confuse those two, it's a big accounting problem. And they add that some of the carbon absorption that is claimed in those inventories, in those reports, isn't even happening. Then another source of for this gap is the problems around methane emissions. Second major portion of the missing greenhouse gases, approximately 2 billion tons of CO2 equivalent per year in that gap at the global level. For three main sectors, the oil and gas sector, where there are leaks from pipelines and other sources, in the agriculture, you know, the role of ruminants, and also around landfills and the methane emissions from human waste. Then the third and last area where there's a big under-reporting is the so-called F gases, which are sometimes not reported at all by some countries or badly reported. And they point to the fact that all of this is the result of questionably drawn rules, incomplete reporting in some countries, and apparently willful mistakes in others. And also that there is no inclusion of any kind of top-down approach, a top-down approach that would involve, for example, satellite monitoring. So they only start from bottom-up approach, where you take a sector, an activity, and then you multiply by an emission factor, you multiply by the number of activities of that kind, and then you have a total. But probably some of those comments, some of those remarks can be relevant for the what you will discuss further in this seminar. So we know that, and this is the last diagram coming from the this summer's IPCC report I wanted to show. We know that there's a very clear, almost linear relationship between the cumulative CO2 emissions, which are shown on this axis, and the increase in temperature, which means that every ton of CO2 that we add to the atmosphere and that we don't remove explicitly is pushing the temperature higher. So let me conclude. The climate system only understands real emissions, which is a very basic fact. Underreporting and dubious accounting is pervasive, at least at the global and country level, and trust between countries. But you have the same problem if you talk about products and the carbon footprint for products. If you want consumers to have trust about the carbon footprint associated to their products, you also need to be sure that you don't have the kind of problems I have evoked here appearing. Top-down methods, including satellite monitoring, are useful complement to bottom-up methods, at least for those big numbers. Of course, you're not going to monitor individual products with satellites, I know that, but maybe there's some of that idea which can be recycled one way or another. And there's one thing I want to conclude on that COPs cannot negotiate with the laws of physics, the laws of nature. Thank you very much for your attention. And this is the website where right now you can find all those slides if you wish. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm sorry, I cannot stay because I have to rush to another talk I have to give in the center of Glasgow, and I cannot stay for the discussion, unfortunately.
That's fine. Thank you very much. That was brilliant. We're now going to switch over to Zoom briefly, I think, to welcome Professor Andrea Ramirez. Is that right, Oscar?
Yes.
You. Amazing.
You see
Andrea,
me?
can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Do you see me?
Not yet.
Well, I can.
Can you hear us now?
Yes, I hear you.
Fantastic. Okay, so you're now live in the room, so I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Yeah, perfect. Do you see my slides?
We can.
Yeah, perfect, because I cannot see myself now in the screen. So thank you very much for inviting me. And it's great to just come after this such a nice introduction, because it saves me a lot of, space and words to try to point out some of the things I think are making the picture very, very, very confusing. So the first thing I would like to point out is the difference between reduction and removals, which I think is coming more and more in the picture. They are not the same, and we need both. It's not to say that one over the other. Actually, we will need both. What I mean by carbon reduction, and sometimes people refer to it as carbon avoidance, is that in net terms, and I really put in bold the word net, so when you put all the ins and all the outs in N terms, you are still adding carbon to the atmosphere. But that carbon is less than it would have been emitted if you don't put, whatever technology you put in place, or change of behavior, or whatever of the carbon reduction options that we have at hand. Carbon renewal, if you look in net terms, we have a physical reduction of CO2 from the atmosphere. And I think that is a very, very important kind of difference. And what I try to explain when I explain it to my students is to say, just think a little bit when you go on a Saturday to the center and you see a sale and appear something that is 20% off and you buy it and you arrive home and the story that you bring home is, I save money. But then you or your partner or your friend or whoever it is going to your bank account, you will see that actually the amount that you have in your account has decreased. Yes, you save money, but you did spend money. You have less money, less budget in your account. That's something very similar to what's happening. The fact that you save carbon, that you avoid carbon, doesn't mean that your carbon budget suddenly got bigger. Actually, it's still smaller because you have actually emitted carbon. So you have not increase the space, you just emitted less. And the confusion between carbon avoided and carbon negative is really, really counterproductive in terms of what can we expect of each, because we need both. And we can to actually conflate this terminology and conflate the way we refer to negativity, especially, we are going to get into really big problems, or even bigger we have for carbon accounting. So how I look at negative emissions, we published together with Samantha Townsend, who spoke yesterday for Bellona as well, a paper on when are negative emissions, and we just put what we think are 4 basic requirements for negativity. A, the removal has to be physical, and I will speak a little bit about that. B, whatever you take out of the atmosphere has to be taken out in a manner intended to be permanent. 3 is not only the carbon that you take there, it's all the carbon you have to count in all the processes that you use to actually take out the carbon, move it from A to B, all energy, all materials that you needed to actually store it in a permanent way, that have to go into the inventory. And of course, if you want it to be negative, what you take out has to be bigger than what you put in. Now, one of the issues is that a lot of people think they can do carbon accounting because carbon accounting looks quite simple. But in reality, it requires that you understand your technology, you understand the system, whether it is the natural system, the anthropogenic system, but you also need to understand how LCA has developed and what the different concepts and methodologies mean, and actually what are the restrictions when you try to do carbon accounting. So this is just a quote from a CTO I heard once when I was in a meeting. If I read it with you, it says, when we use CO2 in our fuels, for every ton of carbon used, we will emit 2 to 3 tons of negative emissions. And you stand there and you listen to this and you're thinking, what exactly what is happening here? What do you mean with emit negative emissions? How is that possible? And well, a lot of people can say, well, that is in purpose. I'm just going to give the benefit of the doubt to say it's a problem that comes if you look and you say, well, it's people trying to do the best, but suddenly things got messed up. You can actually think of 2 things that are messing up the picture a little bit more methodologically. One is that we are doing a lot of carbon accounting and we are accounting for substitution effects. I will explain what is that. And the second one is that we are keeping the system boundaries of the accounting very narrow. You know, I have seen a lot of carbon negativity to just gate to gate. That's not carbon negativity. So strictly speaking, yes, your number counts, but that is not how we actually should be accounting for. So what is the problem of ocean substitution? Is generally when you go and you say, well, I have a new process and that process is going to produce a product that replaces something that uses fossil fuels. And all the emissions that will have occurred if I keep producing the fossil fuel product, I'm going to assign those to my own. It's a credit. I earn them. It's up to me. But what happens in reality is that substitution is a virtual substitution. It's just an assessment. So the substitution introduces values of emissions that do not happen in reality. It's not an inventory of actual physical emissions. It's very relative to what you are actually substituting. So just to give an example, if you have this type of systems where, for instance, you produce you have a new and novel way of producing product A, and it happens that it produces also a subproduct, product B. Something that's very commonly done is that you go then and you say, oh, wait a second, how is subproduct B produced today? And then you say, oh, well, actually is replacing a different kind of process, and you can account for the CO2 emissions to produce that process, that product that is being displaced. So if I actually meet 3 kilograms of CO2 equivalent in this system, but this system, the product C that now I will not need because suddenly it was produced for free in the other side, uses 4, what people do is say 3 minus 4 equal minus N, and then that minus is interpreted as negative emissions, and that is not the case. It only shows the relative change in emissions compared to a scenario that the modeler has designed to. It's not physical, it just comes from this relative difference and from the assumption that you can actually claim these credits. The other thing that happens with substitution is that it's always relative to a reference. So if I have, for instance, a CO2-based fuel, how much I avoid in terms of CO2 will be highly dependent on what am I thinking I'm displacing. Am I displacing gasoline? Or am I displacing a biofuel? I'm displacing a hydrogen vehicle? Am I displacing an electric vehicle? All these deltas, my CO2 avoidance will be different if I look in the direction of gasoline than if I do the comparison with any of the other options. Of course, most people tend to do just the comparison with, the worst kit in the class, that will be gasoline, and you get the largest, hopefully the largest delta. But over time, when I put my product in 10 years or in 5 years in that specific location, it may be that I began to compare with things that I wasn't intending to compete. So problem is you assume you are displacing that product. You assume you know which product you are displacing, but this is always not the case. It may be that you displace something else. It may be that you add so that the fossil demand stays the same and increased demand in this CO2-based product, for instance, just happened. You don't know. And it's very difficult. We do a scenario analysis, but what we see a lot is that the scenarios are a little bit too tunnel-wise. So we need to actually increase how we look at this. We need to look at different products, at different reference, trying to understand when does it work, when can it have actually adverse impacts. As we move, and hopefully I'm still a positive people that we are going to change and we are going to defossilize our economy. The benefits of substitution will decrease over time. So we need to do carbon accounting that is dynamic and not assume benefits that are constant over time, because that overestimates the impact of replacement. And the third point, of course, substitution effects are not inherently permanent. Sometimes we see that we implement something with a mechanism, incentive. Once the incentive is gone, then things go back to reality, and we are seeing it now with flying behavior after COVID. So we need to be very careful how do we think the system will develop. The other thing that we see a lot, and I spoke a little bit before that, is that we think and we see this carbon negativity or carbon neutrality at gate. So it does not take into account downstream emissions. Sometimes it doesn't take into account upstream emissions. That doesn't say anything about negativity. It just tells you what is the balance at a given point. You cannot assign negativity, you cannot assign neutrality kind of marks unless you have the whole total system. And the system boundaries matter. I'm not going to go into detail in this, but in the publication that we did in Carbon Negative, it was a very simple exercise of just having exactly the same system and expanding the system boundaries and going from being carbon negative to carbon positive to again carbon negative, depending on what you include or you exclude. If we are going to account for carbon neutrality, if we are going to account for carbon negativity, we need to have the system boundaries as wide as possible. We need to try to understand the system and really put as much as possible in there. The other issue that I would like to tackle very, very fast is how do we define permanent? We say in a manner intended to be permanent. What is that? How long is long enough? And what people don't realize is that there is no really correlation between the time horizon that we determine something will be permanent and the atmospheric lifetime of CO2. Because CO2 is absorbed in different processes. We know, and according to the IPCC, around 50% is removed within a century, but 20% stays more, for much, much, much longer. So what is permanent? And if you go look in literature and you look at OMCC, They have, say, 100 years, but if you look, for instance, at the PEF guidelines in Europe, they will say suddenly 300 years. Some people say 10,000 years. In life cycle assessment, you have permanence on 50 years, on 100 years, on 100 years, on 500 years. So there is no a clear guideline. And the point that I would like to make is that when you are having a time horizon, what you are actually doing is discounting the long-term impacts. So if you have a time horizon that is very short, let's say 20 years or 50 years, and you say 50 years is permanent, doing something that has temporal storage will have more value than doing long-term storage. On the contrary, you say the longer time horizon, we need to guarantee 1,000 years, we need to guarantee 300 years. The less value temporal storage has. But whether we choose a 70 or a 100 or a 200 is not a life cycle assessment problem. It's a value choice that we do about impacts of future generations. And values have to be taken by all of us. So it's not the modeler problem, it's us trying to identify what the issue is. My final two slides. So the other discussion that is going around, can we store carbon in products? And I just have an indicative average lifetime of different products we have, with buildings having the longer permanence, we have plastics, urea, fuels having very, very long short user lives. And people are saying, well, let's extend the lifetime. They just do circularity as long as possible. And although it looks a very attractive concept, and I think there is some potential in it, this system doesn't maintain itself by own. You will need to add energy, you will need to add material, you will need to transport things. So in the moment you do that, you are beginning to add also carbon flows. So the question I have when you look at this kind of system is who controls the system, who actually checks the carbon balance, who checks that in the circular system that started as a negative system, suddenly you have put so much little fossil carbon here and there that suddenly shifts and is now carbon positive. Who has custody of the carbon over the third cycle? The first cycle is clear, the second, the third, where is the liability there? So the more complex we create the system, the more difficult that it's going to be to govern them and monitor them and verify them. So if you ask me, I will say, let's have really simple, short chain, permanent storage so that we can actually keep track of where the carbon is. And I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Ramirez. So we've gone from the duality of needing top-down and bottom-up approaches to emissions monitoring through to the relativity of negative emissions, the need for dynamic carbon accounting, and the pitfalls of circularity. I'm getting a bit lost personally, so I will hand over to Anna Sardona now from Bellona to help us understand this a bit more.
Okay. So I know that so far we've heard some concepts which seem, as Theo said, sort of complicated, and it is a complex system that we're trying to navigate. So essentially what I'll try to do is summarize also Professor Ramirez's presentation in a couple of different very simple principles that we can apply to make sure that we sort of look at where the carbon comes from and where it goes, and that it doesn't end up in the atmosphere. So I had a brief walk through Glasgow the other day. I noticed something that I haven't noticed before. So a lot of the businesses on the streets were advertising how they were either carbon neutral, net zero. We even had a carbon negative example. And I thought to myself, how are people walking through the streets meant to actually discern whether that is true or not? Or how could they actually verify that this information provided to them is actually true? And the issue is that, as Andrea already pointed out, essentially emissions can be miscalculated a lot, and people can do that in different ways. A simple example that she already mentioned was changing the scope of the assessment, for example. So if you just exclude the end of life of your product from the assessment, you're essentially giving yourself a very big discount in the carbon emissions that you say you produce with your product. The simple example would be a plastic bottle. Let's say you buy one, it is produced with a certain amount of energy, certain amount of fossil fuels, electricity, and then you use it, it doesn't emit anything there. But then when you discard it, it ends up in a waste incinerator or in the environment, and it emits that CO2 back into the atmosphere. But if the producer is not counting that final CO2 emission, they may actually be emitting a very large portion of the impact of the product that it actually has. So that is something that we need to address on a global level and an international level. And we need to standardize these methodologies to make sure that they're actually reflecting the same things. So if you're doing a cradle to grave analysis, I also need to do one so we can compare our products. So there's a couple of key questions that you can ask yourselves when you're assessing either a product or a technology and its carbon neutrality. The first one that everyone before me also mentioned is, where does the carbon actually come from? Is it from the biogenic source? If so, what kind of ILUC system is related to it? Has it caused any deforestation? Is it from a fossil source? So even if it's a process emission, for example, from the cement industry, where you're releasing carbon that was locked in limestone for thousands of years, that is also a fossil emission. Or is it from the air? Are you directly capturing it from the air? And if so, what energy are you using it to get that carbon? Another question to ask is, which claims can actually be backed up by physical data and metrics? There's a lot of assumptions that people make in their assessment sometimes. One example that we heard earlier was substitution. Oh, so I produce a carbon neutral fuel, therefore somebody else is going to keep a barrel of oil in the ground. Unfortunately, the markets don't work that way. So often these assumptions are quite unrealistic, and we have to keep them to a certain standard of sort of physical measurements to make sure that they're actually changing the system. And the final point is that the carbon and where it ultimately ends up is really important. So the permanence of storage that Dr. Ramirez mentioned is really important. So if we're saying that we're storing a carbon molecule in a plastic bottle, how long is that plastic bottle going to store it essentially? Is it going to end up in the environment and emit it, or in a waste incinerator and emit it again into the atmosphere? So all of these impacts are really important. And maybe to just summarize some of the last slides from Professor Ramirez as well, basically, if we just draw a map of where that carbon comes from, what it does in the economy, and where it goes out of it, we can very clearly see just the basic sort of flows that then help us say whether that product is either climate positive or contributing to causing climate change, whether it's carbon neutral, or whether it's removing carbon from the atmosphere. So essentially, we know that the issue is that we're placing fossil carbon into the atmosphere, and that is adding to the stock. So any activity that has carbon from fossil sources and it is emitting to the atmosphere will cause climate change. Whereas we can mitigate that by changing either the production process to avoid the extraction of that carbon in the first place, or capturing it and storing it, but permanently, to avoid climate change. And then the last one will be, if we are capturing atmospheric carbon and permanently storing it away from the atmosphere, then we can actually say that we are removing carbon. And then these are sort of some of the basic carbon flows that can illustrate to you the main sort of impact of the product. And to that, you can always add more complexity. So things like additional sort of life cycle impacts are really important. But to have these sort of basic principles to assess is a really good starting point. So I'm going to leave it at that, and really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Anna. So we're going to move to a panel discussion now. We've got about 45 minutes. So I'm going to welcome Hermanot, Angel Sue, David Rayner, and Vice Mayor Surin Stav to the panel. I'll let each of them give a brief introduction when we're going. But Angel, if I could turn to you first. So Anna just then spoke about the proliferation of methodologies and approaches to this. Could you tell us a bit about the work that you've been doing and some of the initiatives that are underway to try and consolidate this?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I direct a research group called the Data Driven Enviro Lab. And our mission is to apply data science, data-driven techniques to climate policy questions. And last year, we worked with the New Climate Institute to develop 2 reports focused on net zero commitments, primarily coming from subnational and non-state actors, businesses, financial institutions, local cities, and also state governments. And what we found is exactly as you said, there's been a huge trend since the IPCC published the 2018 1.5 degree special report that set the goalpost for net zero by 2050. And so we've seen a huge proliferation of different companies and local governments that are pledging net zero, but also at the same time, a huge proliferation in what that actually means. And so words like net zero, carbon neutral, zero emissions, net negative emissions, they've all come to be meaning the same thing. And really there's not any standardization of what these organizations and entities ought to be aiming for when it comes to pledging these targets. And so then all of them kind of get lumped into one basket where Microsoft is pledging net negative, and that's being seen in the same light as other groups that are just saying, oh, well, we are going to be pledging zero emissions or 80% reduction of our direct emissions, but then not accounting for scope 3 or other indirect emissions, which Professor Ramirez, that's exactly what she was getting at, the fact that often these commitments are not capturing that scope 3 of embodied or life cycle emissions. And so it's a huge challenge, and we need to be working more towards standardizing the definitions of net zero carbon neutrality, and also standardizing what we are asking different companies and governments to report. So the fact that many of them don't cover these scope 3, that's really critical as a gap.
Yeah, brilliant. And David, so how does this play out in policy terms? You know, you've spent a lot of time working on social acceptance and trust around some of these technologies. How do we take some of these principles, apply it to policy and regulation so that we get a more robust approach?
I mean, obviously, this is a huge challenge. I was very pleased that Professor Van Iepersal mentioned the wonderful work that the Washington Post did this week, which kind of pointed out this big gap. And I think the fact that it was in the Washington Post is in itself kind of evidence of the public appeal, the kind of the wider import of what at some level sometimes feels like quite esoteric, quite detailed and technical analyses, right? So people won't be able to necessarily appreciate the subtleties to do with scope 1 versus scope 3 or scope 2 versus scope 3 especially. But I think that they will have this kind of intuitive sense of the importance of getting the accounting right. And so I you know, in terms of policy terms, I think that it ends up being quite resonant amongst policymakers who, again, will understand not so much the climate and environmental side of things as much as they might translate it into financial accounting, the need to have kind of a rigorous and agreed upon set of definitions that will allow us to be able to assess progress or success and measure that very, very clearly. I think that the challenge, and you see this partly in terms of it's almost like a proxy. So Andrea showed very, very nicely, for example, a number of the different places that you could be storing CO2 and fuels, for example, which are very low, right? Essentially, there's no permanence there. But nevertheless, if you think of some of the so-called negative emissions options like direct air capture, the number of direct air capture proposals that claim to then turn it into fuels. They want us to have this kind of skip over the step that the CO2 is essentially immediately being re-released, and somehow have people think, oh, well, direct air capture is a negative emissions technology, and therefore we should be investing in this technology. So I think those are the sorts of tensions or the challenges that we face when you have private sector actors that are trying to potentially push their preferred arrangement as being negative, or even, when in fact they're maybe neutral at best.
Yeah, fantastic. So, Siren, just coming to you briefly. So, thinking about your role as a policymaker, this is quite a technical discussion. Right?
Yeah.
Is this something that your constituents are engaged in at all? How do you go about providing that kind of accountability mechanism to your constituents and really showing that, as a local authority, you're really driving this agenda forward in a robust way?
Yeah, so in Oslo, we are focused mainly on our direct emissions. We have a goal of reducing our emissions by 95% within 2030. That makes sense in terms of our direct authority, and also in line with the Paris Agreement scope 1. But we also have ambitions to reduce indirect emissions and what happens outside our borders. And this is where accounting becomes really important, because we have more control over what's happening directly in Oslo. But actually, the indirect emissions are much higher. Like, consumption is one of the keys, to tackle, but it's also the hardest one because we don't have the data, and we still don't have good enough data for the direct emissions, at least not at a local level. That's something we're trying to improve and challenging national authorities, because Oslo has implemented a climate budget. So we're integrating. We say we're counting CO2 like we're counting money. We're trying to make it transparent. So that's how we work with our direct emissions and the emissions that we control as a municipality. So this the transparency, accountability is the main motivation for doing that. But when it comes to the indirect emissions, we still work with that, even though we don't have the data. We can't see the, in the statistics, the effect of what we're doing, but it's, we need to do something about it, even though we can't count it. So then we use public procurements, and there we have criterias where we climate effect of different projects are something we emphasize. But and there are some standards, but still there are so many projects that don't have a set of standards, so it makes it harder. But we have some life cycle assessment is obviously a tool that's been mentioned here, and some eco labels and some environmental standards. But there's still a lot to go on there for us to be able to purchase the most environmental friendly, and to know what we need to know that a ton of CO2 is a ton of CO2. And we don't always know that, because we don't know about the value chain. We don't have control over all of it. So that's something for national authorities. We have to challenge. That's also, in general, we need more tools on local levels. And of course, that difference, that's the huge difference between country to country, how much authority you have on a regional, local level. But also we need better data, and we need more tools to handle this. But you also need a set of standards, preferably on a global scale. But maybe we could start with the EU, or at least national scale, because we can't put that standards or demand that at the local level in Norway, at least.
Brilliant. And then last but certainly not least, Herman, so you've been a national politician, right? You've been an MP and a researcher and an activist and a lawyer and countless other things. So perhaps you could just tell us a bit about the work that you do with Client Earth, and how litigation and campaigns can really drive corporate accountability on some of these issues.
I think the damage that is inflicted by false claims, by greenwashing, cannot be overstated, actually. I mean, there have been warnings for decades against carbon accounting as being complex, and we've just heard it. It is extremely complex. But if those companies that actually practice greenwashing carry on with it, trust in this kind of accounting will be completely gone. And if that is gone, it's not an instrument anymore. That's why, especially business who are serious about it, should make everything possible to stop other companies from doing it. And one way of doing it, a couple of years ago, some of our lawyers got really dismayed, were upset by a BP greenwashing campaigns, because BP was portraying itself as, well, the renewable energy company. So what they did was they got together with colleagues from DSMOC. They collected the data and the information, and our lawyers then assessed whether this was, what this meant in legal terms. You need both. You need the facts and you need the legal kind of assessment of how to do it. Then they went to, and I'm reading this, the UK National Contact Point for the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprise. Wow, that's actually the UK authority where people can complain that companies do not follow the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprise. This was lodged, and 3 months later, BP stopped its campaign. So the National Contact Point didn't have to give an assessment of it, and it didn't take a final decision, but they expressed that our assessments were founded and that they were correct. There was one victory which we have done, which we have scored. So then we opened the greenwashing file, together with DSMOC, and you can find it on our website. You can find the largest fossil fuel companies, oil and coal, in Europe, and contradict what they say to the public and how they portray themselves, and what they say to investors and shareholders. And I mean, I'm warning you, you'll be shocked. There is no comparison between those two. And this has already happened. It's not stopping there. I mean, just today, I think, I got my mailbox, Carbon Market Watch. They have uncovered that more and more fossil fuel companies are now engaging in something that they call carbon neutral fossil fuels. I mean, this is, they say, like hot snow or dry water, right? It just doesn't go together. But relentless. I mean, these companies try to use every gap that they find in order to expose that, and legal ways of stopping that are very important. I mean, it's okay to get public opinion on your side and to have a good campaign, but if you've got the legal stick, so to speak, in the back that you can use, it of course is much more convincing, and that's what BP discovered. It's much more convincing, and so they stopped it.
But ultimately, so I totally agree. Ultimately, though, in order to do this, I think the clear things, some of the clear themes that are coming through at COP is that, you know, voluntary is insufficient. We're going to need to move towards mandatory disclosure of targets, plans, corporate and across all levels of government as well. And ultimately, that we're going to need regulation to drive this, right, in order to provide that accountability structure. So Angel, just coming back to you for a minute, I'm sure many people noted, but during the World Leaders Summit, the UN Secretary General announced he was launching this expert group on effectively on greenwashing and other things. Could you tell us a bit about that and just how important you think that initiative is going to be?
Yeah, so the UN Secretary General last week talked about launching an accountability group specifically aimed at non-state actors, private companies and institutions that are not necessarily regulated currently. And of course, these were key actors for the Paris Agreement when it was announced and agreed upon in 2015, the fourth pillar of the Paris Agreement, recognizing that all levels of government and private actors need to also contribute to the fight against climate change. It's not just national government, state level actors alone that can do it, because of many of these gaps that we've been talking about, gaps in action, gaps in accountability and credibility, and also the ability to just reduce emissions to what we need to contain global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so aiming at greenwashing and trying to be able to then be a body to check all of these different actors that are making pledges, particularly for net zero. And so I think it's really credible. And as you were talking and framing this question and saying, oh, now we need like this top down, it's just really interesting. In my climate change class 2 weeks ago, we were talking about the origins of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Kyoto Protocol, and frankly saying how this top down system didn't work. And that's why with Paris, we had to do this bottom up process. And I think 5 years later, we're saying that it's clearly not enough. We can't just leave people and leave organizations to, and I think it's frankly sad. I think a lot of what Herman was talking about with this greenwashing, I think it's frankly sad. And so I think what it just stresses that is that we kind of need all levels of approaches, top down and bottom up, and we need to all contribute to this credibility and to the need to make these actions more accountable.
So, and David, what's the role for policy within that, at a national level?
I mean, so I don't think there is really a gold standard yet. I mean, again, the fact that the Norwegians aren't able to get their act together to give Oslo guidance is kind of maybe is a bit of a chastening for the rest of us who are struggling to get our own governments on board. But again, ultimately, the credibility of national efforts, the credibility of the international regime hinge on that we actually bridge this gap. And I think that's exactly right. I teach the same, probably, the flaw of Kyoto was that we tried to insist that it be done in a top-down way. Many of us have always known that, there are benefits of having done now this bottom-up approach of getting, for example, many developing countries on board who wouldn't have gotten on board otherwise. So that's all really important. But then the challenge is, how do you really develop some sort of accounting standard that will be rigorous, not just in the Nordics or the Germanys or the UKs of the world, but that really we can apply in the private sector and in the developing world. I mean, that's an enormous challenge that we face in the coming years.
Yeah.
And I think the whole credibility of the regime then hinges on that.
Yeah. So, Siren, I'll come back to you if that's okay. So, this isn't a new question in many ways, and the fact that there are a multitude of initiatives and standards and methodologies around this is clearly, it's clearly an issue, and it's evidence of the fact this is an ongoing question. As a policymaker at a local level, what is it that you need to really, in order to build that trust between you and your constituents? Is it like one standard? Would a standard coming down from the UN, for example, really help to drive that? Or do you think it's something that Norway can develop and kind of shape and then export to the world? How do you think we can go about doing this in order to really build that trust with people who, quite frankly, aren't engaged in this conversation?
Yeah, hard question. I think our focus has been on the direct emissions, and there we know a lot of what we have to do. And I think using our public procurements and also creating a market together with other cities, like in C40 network, because cities are progressive, much more progressive than the nation states we've seen, and we're now spreading the climate budgeting across the globe. So bottom-up approach, where we're learning from each other. And I'm attending this clean construction debate on Thursday, and where just a couple of years ago, the world hadn't seen an electrical machine at the construction site. We had a pilot operating with the private sector businesses. A few years later, it's the standard in Oslo. Now the national authorities are looking at it, and so we scaled it up. And I think that's how we need to work, a lot of ways, piloting, cooperating with the businesses. We have a business climate network in Oslo, and I've had like a line with businesses this fall wanting to sign an agreement to cooperate with the city government, because they want to be a part of the solution, and they are aware that they don't have a standard to compare. So I think that is a thing that the national authorities need to maybe help finding a standard for each sector or type of business, because that's hard to do on your own. But you also need front runners, because you do have somebody's just going ahead doing something and it just becomes a standard. So that's also a way of working, like somebody's just a front runner doing it, and then that's the new standard, like we're doing on the construction sites. So I think definitely a bottom up is the way, and but you also need, especially when it comes to indirect emissions and consumption of goods. I think EU would be a key to a standard there, because that's harder for us. That's scope 2 and 3 to have control at a local level at least.
Yeah, fantastic. Herman, I'm going to come to you in 1 second. Just before I do, can I just check if there are going to be many questions from the audience? So we've got one. Okay, I'll ask my question, then we'll come to you, and everyone else can have a think about what they want to ask as well. So we've just talked a bit about engaging citizens in this debate, right? And activating and mobilizing society to hold corporations to account. What's the best way of doing that? Is litigation the way to do it, to expose this stuff and then activate people that way, or are there other options as well?
Well, I'm very tempted actually to embark also on this discussion of top-down, bottom-up, because actually the Kyoto Protocol was very, very effective. Actually, emissions sank much, much more, were reduced much, much more than they were prescribed. There was only one reason why it didn't work: the US. The US has a constitution which is not fit for the 21st century, because it gives the Senate, who has to kind of adopt with a 2/3 majority an absolute veto. That's the reason why it didn't work. And I think it's time. I mean, this is the litmus test here. I mean, we are at COP26. This is the litmus test whether this approach works or not. One of the reasons why I've joined Climate Earth like 3 years ago is that I've discovered in politics, but also at the international, at the intergovernmental level, that, I mean, there are serious kind of problems in embarking upon a policy that actually would lead us on a path which is sustainable 1.5 degrees. And that the potential of litigation was untapped yet. And this is being discovered now, not only by Climate Earth, also by other organizations in the national jurisdictions. Well, we had in the Netherlands courts which were ordering their government to improve their climate policy, ordering Shell to reduce its own emissions. We've had a French case where the French government was ordered by the court to improve its legislation. And in Germany, the constitutional court decided that what the government had put into the climate protection law was simply not enough, because it was actually violating the rights of the next generation. And so it went back to the government. They had to improve. One of the reasons why courts can do that is that they do not follow an economic logic. And much of our society is kind of pervaded with a so-called economic logic, like everyone has to do it. If only some do it, it doesn't work. It has to be a global effort. Well, that's bullshit, right? And the Constitutional Court, with some kind of legal realism, said, no, I mean, what your percentage is doesn't matter. If you have an obligation, you must follow. That's it, basically. And not this kind of excuses. I mean, Australia is doing it. We are supporting the Torres Strait Islanders. That's some islands which are very low-lying. Australian territory. They have brought a complaint against their own government before the Human Rights Commission. And Australia defends itself by saying, first of all, well, our contribution is minuscule compared to the global. And second, well, you are not affected by climate change. It's going to be your children and your grandchildren. Can you believe that? That is Australia defending itself before the Human Rights Commission. And that's what the law actually provides, is some kind of logic which is different from the all-pervasive economic logic, which very often leads us into a very wrong direction. And what it also does, it empowers people. I mean, it's not us, basically. We are supporting people who complain against a coal-fired power plant, for example. So we're supporting them to fight against that power plant or fight for a nature reserve or whatever. And this is restoring trust in democracy and trust in the rule of law. And I mean, coming back to what we're discussing here, trust is most important. And we've seen in the pandemic, in those countries where people trust their government, it works. Where they don't, it doesn't. And it will also, the same with climate change. If people don't trust governments, if people don't trust the companies that they are, telling the truth, then it will not work. And then we have to resort to strict regulation, basically. And I think we are at a point where this is being decided.
Okay, one final question, sorry. Open question to anyone that wishes to answer it. So trust is key. How do we leave Glasgow with the UNFCCC having restored trust in the ability of multilateral institutions and governments to tackle climate change?
Or is that a foregone conclusion? Like this is.
I hope it is. Any takers? I'll tell you what, I'll give you a minute to think about it. We'll take the question from the audience. Does anyone else, would anyone else? Okay, we've got two more as well. We'll take all three questions, if that's okay. We'll take all three questions and then I'll turn to each of you. Professor Ramirez, would you like to come in at all as well in the Q&A? Yeah, okay, I'll bring you in as well. Thanks.
Hi, well, very loud. My name is Julian. I think there's been a lot of discussion about, how we need a methodology for this accounting, but the Science-Based Targets Initiative really lays out a clear sort of criteria on how to account for the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and lays out sort of, I think that's actually quite well defined. And that's both for corporate and national bodies. For me, the hard part is scope 3 emissions are just really, really hard to get the number for. So there's a methodology for doing it. Like, it's very clear, you need to include scope 3 into your pledges of net zero, but how you actually get that number is the really hard bit. And I think just be interested to hear the panel's thoughts on that aspect, saying, okay, we have a criteria, but how are we actually going to get those numbers to do the accounting? Because I think it's really hard.
Brilliant. And we'll take this question here, the two over there, and then we'll do a round. Yeah, these two over here. Thank you. If you could just say who you are and where you're from as well, that'd be great.
Yes, I live in France, and I founded and I manage a company which is devoted to the transition, globally transition, so not only climate. And we have developed a methodology for measuring the impact, social impact, and the environment impact of activities for enterprises, but also for public authorities. That is, and we start off with the budget. So in France, the public authorities have a budget for fonctionnement and a budget for investissement. I would like to come back to what you said about the economic logic. I would say the so-called economic logic, because I speak also as an accountant. I'm a trained chartered accountant, retired, of course. The accounting that we have was developed to report to shareholders. So it places finance at the center of the accounting system and considers environment and social as being externalities. If we have understood anything about our relation to nature, what we call nature, we tend to call nature all that is not human. We have forgotten the fact that we are inside nature, and we need an accounting system which takes account of that fact. So we have an accounting system which is totally inadequate, and we still have a long way to go. And I would be interested in knowing a little bit more about how we are doing things in Oslo, because we have had some tenders in France, and one of the tenders referred to what you are doing in Oslo. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks. And sorry, one more question, and then we'll take a round of answers.
Thank you very much. So, oh, sorry. That's all right. So it's more a question to other panelists. So I'm Jie. I work at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. So I design and run accelerator programs, mainly working with entrepreneurs and innovators. So my question is actually, we talk about bottom up and top down approach. But my question is about there's only 2 countries, UK and France, has set net zero legally binding. So my question is about the role of legislation. Like looking ahead, do you see more and more countries will set this goal as legally binding? And would that be a strong push from the government that encourage a strong take up from business, both private sector and public sectors? Yeah, would love to hear your views on that. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. So we've got 3 questions there. One on how we properly account for Scope 3 emissions, one on the role of the financial sector and the integration of nature as well as climate, and then one on the outlook for net zero regulation. Who would like to go first? Brilliant. Yeah. Thank you.
That's the $1 million question. So in our reports that we published last September and October, we evaluated close to 2,000 companies that report to CDP. Many of them are science-based target initiative companies. The number of companies that actually reported Scope 3 emissions, less than 1%. It was shocking. And in the latest SBTI progress report, they say nothing about Scope 3 emissions, frankly, because not enough companies are reporting them. I mean, that's the heart of this credibility gap and greenwashing when we talk about this. So you've got thousands of companies that have joined the Race to Zero campaign that are claiming that they're going to go net zero by so-and-so end date. But then when they're not reporting any of the relevant emissions to actually make and evaluate the credibility of those claims, it's just impossible. It is greenwashing at the end of the day. And so it's a huge problem. The other hat that I'm wearing here at the COP26 negotiations is through a project called it's CAMDA 2.0. And so CAMDA is kind of like a weird acronym and I can't even remember. So it's like CAMDA, the Analytic Community for Credible Climate Action. And so we launched a declaration last Saturday. I think there's going to be a press release coming out on the UNFCCC website on Thursday. But it's how can we use next generation technologies, Earth observation data, machine learning, and artificial intelligence, sensors, for example, the Internet of Things. How can we use these technologies to help get the data, fill in those gaps so that we don't rely on self-reported data? So that's the future. That's the roadmap. We have to get there because if you look at the current landscape of data reporting, even if we do have requirements and legislation to mandate disclosure, it's just not going to happen at the pace and scale that we need to get that Scope 3 data or to get enough of a picture of global emissions so we can make the connections of these are my direct emissions, these are my emissions from purchased electricity, and then these are my emissions coming up and down the supply chain. We're not going to get there for self-reported data.
Yeah, brilliant. Siren, can we come to you on the nature question and how that's being brought in Oslo?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I quite understood the question. How we implement, how
nature's considered in your kind of policy frameworks, I think, and the role of the financial sector in ensuring we deliver on both climate and nature.
Yeah, so in the climate budgeting, the focus is on emissions, but in our climate strategy, it's more comprehensive, and we're working also with, Oslo has a lot of forests, surrounding, there. We have a lot of forests surrounding Oslo, and rewilding the forest is actually a part of our climate strategy, and also nature strategy, taking care of the nature. Oslo is the municipality in Norway, believe it or not, with the most biodiversity in whole of Norway. Wow. And so we have also a goal of preserving green spaces, green areas, waterways. So we have a comprehensive policy on also the nature parts, and not in a part of the accounting in the climate budgeting. So, but that's a hot topic for area neutrality. That's sort of the new something that we have to work on, that we're not there yet, how we operationalize it, but definitely this is something that also yeah, our national authorities have a long way on. We just got a new government that's not really taking us where we need, but at least in Oslo, we have a clear policy in how to preserve the nature. And that's also part of storing carbon. So I don't know if that I was answering the question concerning the financial aspect. Yeah.
Brilliant. Herman.
Man has raised a very important point, and I mean, a lot of our accounting, and especially in business, is centered around finance. So, and if everything else is kind of a side effect, and that points to a larger problem that I mean, we as humans tend to see ourselves at the top of the pyramid, right? And everything else is kind of yeah, our subject, our object, and to kind of this dichotomy between us and nature, I think that's the fundamental problem. We can go at it, have a go at it in changing our accounting systems. We can have a go at it in changing the laws, by the way. Stop Ecocide, that's an organization that we support, and it's trying to get a new crime into the statute of the International Criminal Court and making it a crime, large-scale environmental destruction. When we look at the managers of companies, for example, they are usually not responsible personally for the destruction that their companies do. We try to find ways to hold them accountable, and I think that's very important. That government leaders, but also company leaders and the management, they cannot excuse themselves by saying, well, I mean, this was the company, it wasn't me. And to establish some kind of responsibility and liability. And the way to do, one way to do is actually look at, is it doing damage to their own company? Because then they are being liable, right? And misjudging and I mean, keeping a company on a fossil fuel track while everything is changing around us, that's certainly putting the company in danger. So that's one way of bridging this gap between us and nature.
Brilliant. And David, I'm loath to let Cambridge answer Cambridge, but could you tell us about the outlook for net zero regulation and laws, please?
I mean, and I also try maybe to talk a little bit about scope 3. I mean, I think the real, it's laudable that countries like, say, the UK and France have nominally legally binding 2050 targets. I think the real question in all these cases is what is actually done in the 2020s. And, you know, if you think about the history of things like air pollution regulation or motor vehicle standards, what you find is that you have certain jurisdictions that moved quite aggressively, and then companies didn't want to have a situation where they were, you know, complying with a, you know, Vermont standard for motor vehicles or a Finnish standard on air pollution or something. So there is a logic whereby if you do have national governments impose measures, for example, that would, you know, mandate scope 3, you know, there is potentially a kind of a virtuous circle that would, you know, that would ensue, because, you know, if a company, they might fight it in the jurisdiction where it would be imposed, but if a Germany or a state of California or something might, you know, impose a really tough kind of set of measures, say on scope 3, that would actually, you know, potentially catalyze other jurisdictions to enact very similar sorts of measures.
Fantastic. Professor Ramirez, I see you've got a hand up. Would you like to come in?
My virtual hand. No, just one point I think is also important is people, you know, we tend to say the order of the factor doesn't affect the results, but it does. So we need to also take a careful look of what is the place of removals and what is the place of reductions. And I think it's very tempting to put all your money in the removals because it will be later on, you know. Removals will not work unless we reduce a lot now. So it is from an economic point of view, from an environmental point of view, from a material point of view, from an infrastructure point of view, the scaling that we will need for removal is so large that we need actually to reduce a lot before we actually start to having the scale of removal that is needed. So something that we need to be very careful in legislation on companies is to guarantee that we are doing a lot of efforts on removals, and we are scaling, a lot of efforts in reductions, and we are scaling removals because we need to have it ready, but not as a replacement of reductions. And I think there's no replacement in paper and no replacement in real life. And I think there's a role for law, it's a role for regulation, it's a role for civil community to really work on this, to try to put the order and to try to guide the system in the right way.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've got about 6 minutes left. I'm going to take one final round of questions, and then I'll give each of the panelists 1 minute to respond and give any final remarks. So there's one question there. Any others? That means you're not off the hook for my earlier question. I haven't forgotten. So we'll take this one. Okay.
Thanks, Theo. Jonas Elseth, Director of Bellona Europa. Actually, mainly question to Andrea, but I think it might be interesting to hear other opinions too. Andrea, great to see you. I don't think you can see me. You know, you and I have been working on, following rather European policy making in the space of biofuels, and later also what we call now electrofuels or synthetic fuels. And I guess the question here is, you know, we know that it took a very long time, years, for the Commission to release the European Commission to release their own documentation around ILUC and the issues around biomass. We know that it's been taking more than a year trying to get them to release your report on LCAs for some of the synthetic fuels that are being pushed. And I guess the question is, to which extent we have a lot of evidence that policymakers, that claims from companies can drive bad policy. But I guess the question is, to which extent do we see also the other way around as being a risk? That the lack of evidence base in politics could be driving companies into making false claims. That's maybe an open question, but if you have some thoughts, Andrea. Thank you.
Great. So we've got 5 minutes, so we'll do that. Andrea, do you want to give your response? And then we'll ask the same question to people in the room, and I'll just nuance my question slightly. So rather than being so specific about the UNFCCC, what's the one thing that you think we need to leave Glasgow with in order to start rebuilding some trust in this system? So, Professor Ramirez?
Yeah, it's not a simple question what Jonas asked, but I think there are two dangers. One is in the complexity of the system, you get a kind of freezing situation. I cannot move because I don't have information. Everything I can do can be wrong. So I have somebody from the government telling me, I don't like LCAs because every time you do an LCA, everything looks worse. So the idea that you know that you don't have control and therefore you don't move is a dangerous one. And the second one is I just start and I see where I go, which is kind of nice unless you start completely in the wrong path. And how do we get in the middle? And I think there is a role of us, and at least universities, education, NGOs, to try to formulate even simple kind of guidelines, as Anna did, or trying to formulate things that are actually, sometimes it's easier to formulate what you should not do than what you should do. So start to limit in the panorama, make it a little bit more transparent. And of course, avoid optimization. We are not going to have the perfect answer, but you don't want to get in a lock-in where we are spending all energy, for instance, to get CO2 that we should be stored permanently and then put it back into the atmosphere if there are other solutions to actually solve problems. So it's always a if. Identifying those are important and being transparent. And I keep repeating transparent a lot because there are value load choices behind LCAs. There is a lot of choices we made which are related to what we think is important, or the client thinks is important, or government think, and those are implicit. So it is important to tell the public what are the choices, what drives the choices that we make in the carbon accounting regarding future generations or trade-offs. Make it explicit so people can also carry out those in their own, requests. Don't make it too just numbers. The numbers mean something. I think that would be my message. I don't know if I answer Jonah's question, but we will do that later.
Brilliant, thank you. So, final remarks. Angel, what would you like to leave Glasgow with?
Yeah, I mean, to quote Greta, no more blah, blah, blah. And with respect to net zero targets and the flurry of actors that are pledging, exactly as David said, you have to match these long-term actions with immediate interim targets, specific actions and plans to get there. If you're using offsets, you have to be transparent, as Andrea said, where those removals are happening, where are the emissions taking place. So I think those details are really critical moving forward.
Brilliant. David?
I mean, I completely agree with Andrea, unsurprisingly, and Angel. But again, the fact that you had fairly, I don't know, glib is the right word. A Brazilian government that's that comes here and signs on to end deforestation is kind of evidence of blah blah blah, right? Whereas there is actually a lot of hard work that needs to be done, and that is at the level of really professionalizing and moving beyond these kind of somewhat nice photo ops, but that don't actually deliver very much. Whereas if we do start to see in 2022, 23, 24, real efforts to begin to pin down some of these numbers, to kind of mandate some of these things, then you'll have some sense that, okay, well, we might be going to see some progress. Right. And not that in the next stock taking in 5 years' time, we'll just sort of kind of, oh, well, we there were all these promises in Glasgow and none of those were delivered. So I think you really want to see a lot more kind of very concrete, kind of boring action that happens over the next year or two.
Great. Herman?
Well, there's long lists of tasks that governments have to achieve. Here, negotiators, but you ask for one. And I think it's loss and damage, actually. Because recognizing, admitting that damages have been inflicted upon people by the actions that rich, early industrialized countries have done, I think this would be a first step for action, because it's not blah, blah, blah. It's actually what lawyers fear most. When it comes to liability, this is it, nothing. And that's true for financial, but it's also true for some kind of guilt. And this is not about guilt, but it's acknowledging that there has been damages, there will be more damages, and that richer countries are willing to pay for it. And that, in turn, I think, will also lead to more action in order to avoid.
Brilliant. And finally?
Yeah. One reflection sitting here, and also your question with we're a part of nature, but we don't act like it. Sometimes I think we're overcomplicating things as well. Too much, it's hard to grasp if you're not really into what we presented earlier here. But we really know what to do. Reduce, reuse, recycle. We know that plant-based food is the best option over hamburgers, even though they're serving it here. We know that you should move your body actively instead of using a car, preferably. We know that you're not a happy person if you're over consuming. Actually, that's a health crisis in itself. The pressure of buying stuff. So there's just a lot of stuff we know what to do, and we know that we should demand goods that have long duration, high quality. These things we can do locally, even though we don't have a standard. We're demanding plant-based food in Oslo. We have a goal of 50% reduction in meat consumption. That's also the indirect emissions. And concerning nature, that's maybe the most important thing we do is actually transforming our food system. I don't feel that's a topic that's that much debated here but that's really a huge issue. Even though my field is transport, that's something also we really need to have a focus on. So I think also sometimes we have to just simplify stuff, because we do know what's necessary and what's the main emitters. So
perfect. So I'm going to really briefly summarize. So more action, don't overcomplicate things. Build trust through both short-term action and recognition for the damage that's already been caused. Credibility matters, accountability matters, real-world emissions matter, not what's on paper. We need better data in order to unlock better policy and better regulation and better methodologies for accounting. Okay, so we'll wrap up there. Thank you to all of our panelists and to Bellona for hosting. And I believe there are some drinks available outside to anyone that wants to hang around. So thank you.